Whispers in the atelier. The September rain pattered against the windows of Olivia Mendez's tiny apartment as she stared at her bank statement. The numbers hadn't magically increased since yesterday, and her father's medication costs certainly hadn't decreased. She set her violin case aside. No practice today, and clicked on the email that had arrived that morning. Studio assistant position available immediately. Music background required. Competitive salary. The address belonged to Blackwood Manor, the infamous estate of Julian Blackwood, once celebrated as the most brilliant composer of his generation before he vanished from public life 5 years ago. Rumors swirled about his reclusiveness, his impossible standards, his cold demeanor, but the salary listed made Olivia's eyes widen. It would cover her father's treatments and then some. She applied without hesitation. 3 days later, Olivia stood before wrought iron gates, clutching her portfolio in trembling hands. The manor loomed against grey skies, its stone facade imposing yet somehow melancholic. Mrs. Harrington, the housekeeper who had conducted the preliminary interview, greeted her with a tight smile. "Mr. Blackwood rarely speaks to anyone directly," she explained, leading Olivia through corridors lined with awards and framed sheet music. "He leaves instructions. You follow them precisely. Do not ask personal questions. Do not enter his private quarters. And never, under any circumstances, touch his piano." The studio took Olivia's breath away. A cathedral to music, with soaring ceilings, wall-to-wall shelves of manuscripts, and instruments displayed like precious artifacts. At its center stood a magnificent grand piano, its gleaming surface reflecting the room like dark water. "You start today," came a voice from the shadows. Julian Blackwood emerged, and Olivia felt a chill. Tall and lean, with angular features and eyes the color of storm clouds, he looked younger than his 38 years, yet somehow ancient in his bearing. There was no handshake, no welcome. "Your credentials are adequate. Your tasks are outlined here." He placed a folder on a desk without meeting her gaze. "You will organize my library, transcribe compositions, and manage correspondence. You will not disturb me when the studio door is closed." Olivia nodded, swallowing her pride. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood. The previous 5 assistants lasted less than a month. I expect no different from you." And with that, he disappeared into an adjoining room, leaving only the lingering scent of cedar and bergamot. Mrs. Harrington sighed. "Don't mind him, dear. He wasn't always this way." The days fell into routine. Olivia arrived at 8 each morning, sometimes finding Julian already working, sometimes finding only notes detailing impossible tasks. His handwriting was elegant but severe, much like the man himself. He spoke little, criticized often, and never once acknowledged her love for music, despite the calluses on her fingertips that marked her as a fellow musician. "These measures are improperly aligned," he said one afternoon, tossing sheets of her careful transcription onto the desk. "Start again." Olivia bit her tongue and nodded. That night, she worked until her eyes burned, determined to prove her worth. When she called her father Emilio, she forced cheerfulness into her voice. "It's a good job, Papa. The pay is worth it. But are you playing me hijack? Your music matters more than money." She glanced at her violin case, gathering dust in the corner of her rented room. "Sometimes we need to be practical." In her 3rd week, Olivia stayed late organizing Julian's library. The manor was quiet, save for distant thunder rolling across the hills. She climbed the ladder to reach the highest shelf, where leather-bound volumes of sheet music needed cataloging. As she stretched, her hand brushed something metallic. A small silver key tumbled down, landing with a soft ping on the hardwood floor. Curious, she examined it. Not like the modern keys to the manor's rooms. This was older, ornate, with a musical note engraved on its bow. From somewhere deep in the manor, she heard it, the faintest melody, so soft she thought she'd imagined it. But there it was again, a haunting piano piece she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, Olivia followed the sound. It led her to a room she hadn't noticed before, tucked away behind the library. The door stood slightly ajar. Through the crack, she saw Julian seated at a smaller, older piano than the one in the studio. His posture was different, shoulders slumped, head bowed. Before him sat a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The music stopped abruptly. Julian's hand hovered over the keys, then fell limply to his side. When he turned toward the window, Olivia caught a glimpse of his face and the silent tears streaming down it. She backed away, heart pounding, knowing she had witnessed something intensely private. As she retreated, the floorboard beneath her creaked. Julian's head snapped up. "Who's there?" His voice was sharp as broken glass. Olivia stepped forward, clutching the silver key. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I was organizing the library and found this." She held out the key, a peace offering. Julian stared at it for a long moment, all color draining from his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Where did you get that?" "It fell from the top shelf." "I heard music and get out," he whispered, then louder, "Get out." Olivia fled, certain she'd just lost her job. She left the key on the desk in the main studio, gathered her things, and hurried through the rain to her car the next morning. She was surprised to find a new note on her desk, not a termination letter, but new instructions. Julian was nowhere to be seen, and beside the note lay the silver key, asterisk crescendo of secrets. The silver key rested beside Julian's note, its presence more bewildering than any instruction he'd left before. Olivia read the message twice, frowning at its brevity. Catalog contents of the Eastern attic. Use discretion. She turned the key over in her palm, wondering if this was a test or a trap. Mrs. Harrington appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup of tea. He hasn't let anyone near that room in years, the housekeeper said, her voice lowered as if the walls might listen. Not since before the accident. What accident? Olivia asked, accepting the tea gratefully. Mrs. Harrington's lined face softened. It's not my place to say, but mind how you tread, dear. Some wounds never fully heal. The eastern attic was accessed through a narrow staircase hidden behind a bookcase in the library. As Olivia ascended the creaking steps, dust motes danced in shafts of light from small dormer windows. The air felt heavy with disuse and memory. The key turned smoothly in the lock. Inside, Olivia found not the jumble of forgotten furniture she'd expected, but a meticulously preserved music room. Sheets covered most items, but she could make out the shapes of music stands, cabinets, and what appeared to be recording equipment. Removing one sheet revealed a cello, its varnish still gleaming despite the years of silence. On a table by the window sat stacks of composition notebooks, each labeled with dates spanning nearly a decade. Beside them, a photograph album lay open to a page showing two young men on stage, bowing to a standing ovation. Julian looked almost unrecognizably younger, certainly, but, more notably, joyful. His arm was slung around the shoulders of another man who bore a striking resemblance to him, though slighter in build and with warmer eyes. A brother, Olivia realized. She'd never heard Julian mention any family. She opened one of the composition books. Inside were handwritten scores, some crossed out and rewritten, others marked with enthusiastic annotations in two distinct handwritings. The music was complex, innovative duets for piano and cello that pushed boundaries of classical composition while remaining hauntingly accessible. At the bottom of one, particularly beautiful passage was written, "For Julianne, because you always hear the music others miss." Ethan. Olivia's phone vibrated. A text from the care facility where her father lived. Mr. Mendez had a difficult morning, medication adjusted, visiting hours until 8 p.m. Her heart sank. The Parkinson's was progressing faster than doctors had predicted, stealing her father's mobility piece by piece. She texted back that she'd be there after work, then reluctantly returned to her task in a cabinet beneath a window. She found recordings, dozens of them, labeled with venues and dates. We're unable to resist. She slipped one marked final performance link and sent her into an old but functional player in the corner. The music that filled the room made her breath catch. Two instruments in perfect dialogue, piano and cello, weaving around each other in a dance of sound that was both technically brilliant and emotionally devastating. She recognized Julian's distinctive style on the piano, but it was the cellist who brought tears to her eyes. His playing held such vulnerability, such raw emotion. So absorbed was she in the recording that she didn't hear the footsteps on the stairs until it was too late. The attic door swung open, and Julian stood framed in the doorway, his face a mask of fury and pain. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, crossing the room in 3 strides to switch off the player. Olivia stood her ground, though her heart hammered. "You asked me to catalog this room. I was trying to understand what I'm cataloging. Catalog, not invade privacy, not play recordings." That his voice broke and he turned away, hands clenched at his sides. "That was your brother," Olivia said softly. It wasn't a question. For a long moment, Julian was silent, his breathing ragged. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if coming from somewhere deep inside himself. "Ethan, my younger brother, the better musician, the better man. What happened to him?" Julian's laugh was hollow. "What happened? I killed him. That's what happened." The stark declaration hung in the air between them. Before Olivia could respond, her phone rang. The care facility again. She answered with trembling fingers. "Miss Mendez, your father has had a fall. He's asking for you." Julian watched her face transform with worry, something flickering in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. "Go," he said simply. Olivia hesitated. "Mr. Blackwood, your father, needs you. The cataloging can wait." At the care facility, Emilio Mendez sat in a wheelchair by the window, his one strong hand trembling uncontrollably in his lap. His face brightened when Olivia entered. "Mi musico," he said, the words slightly slurred but warm with affection. "Play for me." Olivia glanced at the violin case she'd brought on impulse. She hadn't played in weeks, too exhausted from work and worry, but she couldn't deny her father. She positioned the instrument under her chin, closed her eyes, and began to play a Spanish folk melody her father had taught her as a child. As she played, she thought of the recording in Julian's alcove, the conversation between piano and cello, brothers speaking through music when perhaps words had failed them. Her own playing felt different today, more honest somehow. When she finished, she was surprised to find tears on her cheeks. Her father reached for her hand. "You're sad, mija. This job, it takes your music from you. It's complicated, Papa. My employer, he's lost someone. His brother. I think music reminds him of that loss." "Ah," Emilio nodded sagely. "Then he needs your music more than anyone." The facility director caught Olivia in the hallway as she was leaving. "Miss Mendez, I'm sorry, but there's the matter of the additional therapy sessions. With the new medication regimen, I'll figure it out," Olivia interrupted, the familiar knot of financial anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Please don't discontinue anything he needs." It was past midnight when she returned to her apartment. A manila envelope sat propped against her door. Inside was a check for an unexpected bonus, along with a note in Julian's distinctive handwriting for additional hours and discretion. Regarding today, some stories are better left untold. But Olivia couldn't forget the anguish in Julian's eyes, or his terrible words. "I killed him." What had he meant? What tragedy lay behind the beautiful music she'd heard and the brotherhood captured in those photographs? The next morning, Olivia arrived at Blackwood Manor earlier than usual. To her surprise, Julian was at the piano in the main studio, though he wasn't playing, just sitting, staring at the keys as if they might hold answers to unasked questions. "Your father," he said without turning. "What's wrong with him?" Olivia set down her bag, startled by the personal question from a man who'd scarcely acknowledged her existence until yesterday. "Parkinson's disease. It's progressing faster than expected." Julian nodded slowly. "And you play for him?" "The violin. I noticed your calluses the day you interviewed." "When I can. Music helps him remember who he was, who I am." "Yes," Julian said, finally looking at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "Music has that power, to preserve, to destroy, to expose truths we'd rather keep hidden." He stood abruptly. "Come with me." He led her not back to the attic, but to a room she hadn't entered before, a small library with walls lined with medical texts. From a drawer, he withdrew a folder and handed it to her. "Research I've been funding. Experimental treatments for neurological disorders, including Parkinson's. There's a clinic in Boston accepting new patients for a trial. I've taken the liberty of having Mrs. Harrington make inquiries on your behalf." Olivia stared at him, speechless. This gesture of kindness seemed so incongruous with the cold taskmaster she'd known. "Why would you do this?" Julian turned away, his profile sharp against the window light. "Perhaps I recognize the look of someone watching a loved one slip away. Perhaps I'm not entirely the monster you believe me to be." Before she could respond, he walked to the door, pausing on the threshold. "The Eastern Attic. Finish your cataloging." And Olivia, he rarely used her name. "When you're ready to hear the truth about Ethan, about what happened after that final recording, I'll be in the studio." He left her standing amid medical journals and unanswered questions, the folder in her hands promising hope for her father, while Julian's words promised something else entirely, a confession she wasn't sure either of them was ready for. Dissonant revelations. The Boston Clinic's brochure lay open on Olivia's desk, its glossy pages detailing the Parkinson's treatment trial that could potentially help her father. The application forms were already half completed. Julian's influence had expedited the process, bypassing wait lists and preliminary screenings. She should have felt only gratitude, yet uneasiness lingered like an unresolved chord. "You've barely touched your lunch," Mrs. Harrington observed, collecting Olivia's barely eaten sandwich. "The trial is a good opportunity. Mr. Blackwood rarely involved himself in others' affairs." "That's what bothers me," Olivia admitted. "Why now? Why me?" Mrs. Harrington busied herself arranging teacups. "Perhaps you remind him of someone." The cataloging of the Eastern Attic was nearly complete. Over the past week, Olivia had documented every piece of music, every recording, every photograph of the brothers Blackwood in their prime. She'd worked methodically, trying to suppress her curiosity about Julian's cryptic words. "I killed him." Research online had yielded only the basic facts. Ethan Blackwood, celebrated cellist, had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Shortly after a triumphant performance with his brother at Lincoln Center, Julian had disappeared from public life immediately afterward. The articles mentioned Julian had been driving but offered no details beyond tragic circumstances. Today, the final cabinet awaited her attention. Inside, she found no music but personal effects, playbills, travel journals, and a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl. The box was locked. Without thinking, Olivia tried the silver key. It fit perfectly. Inside lay a stack of letters bound with faded ribbon, and beneath them, newspaper clippings with headlines Olivia hadn't seen in her research. Celebrated composer questioned in brother's death. Toxicology report raises questions in Blackwood tragedy. Her hands trembled as she unfolded one clipping. According to the article, traces of alcohol and prescription medication had been found in Julian's bloodstream after the crash. Not enough to be legally intoxicated, but enough to raise questions about his judgment. The case had been closed when no charges were filed, but the court of public opinion had rendered a harsher verdict. "I see you've found the rest of the story." Olivia startled. Julian stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame with deceptive casualness, though his knuckles were white where they gripped the wood. "You should have told me," she said quietly. "Would it have changed anything? Would you have seen me differently than the monster who killed his brother through negligence?" His voice was bitter. "I would have understood better why you shut music out of your life." Julian crossed to the window, looking out at the grounds where autumn painted the trees in fiery colors. "I didn't shut music out. I shut out audiences, critics, the public, that was all too eager to construct a narrative of jealousy and rivalry between brothers who only ever supported each other. He turned to face her. Those articles don't tell you that I was taking medication for insomnia, prescribed by a doctor after months of working too hard. They don't tell you that Ethan and I had just signed a contract for a world tour. They certainly don't tell you that I was reaching for my ringing phone when I missed the curve in the road. The raw anguish in his voice made Olivia's chest tighten. Julian, it was an accident. An accident I caused. An accident that took a brilliant musician from the world and left behind the lesser talent. He gestured dismissively at himself. A cruel cosmic joke. Olivia stood, indignation flaring. That's not true. Your compositions are nothing compared to what Ethan could have created. Julian's hand slammed down on the table, making the contents of the box jump. He was the true genius. I merely had technique. That's not what I heard in that recording, Olivia insisted. You complemented each other. Your precision gave structure to his emotional playing. You were perfect counterpoints. Julian stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. A silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken understandings. Your father, he said finally. How did you learn he was ill? The abrupt change of subject caught Olivia off guard. I was performing with the City Symphony. Not first chair, I'm not that good but good enough to earn a living. Dad came to every performance. One night he dropped his program. His hands were shaking too badly to pick it up. The diagnosis came a week later, and you gave up your position to care for him. It wasn't a question, but, Olivia nodded. There wasn't a choice to make. There's always a choice, Julian said softly. You chose love over art. I chose ambition over attention, and it cost Ethan his life. Before Olivia could respond, Julian's phone chimed. He checked it, his expression shifting to something unreadable. The clinic in Boston has accepted your father into the trial. They need him there next week for preliminary assessments. Olivia's heart leaped, then sank. I can't afford to take that much time away, not if I want to keep this job. Your position will be waiting, Julian said, as will your salary during your absence. Why are you doing this? Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian's gaze fell on the box of memories between them. Because 5 years ago, no one offered me a chance at redemption. Because your father shouldn't lose his dignity to a disease that can possibly be treated. Because he faltered. Because you play violin for a dying man who taught you to love music. And that matters more than cataloging my past. That evening, Olivia sat with her father in his small room at the facility. She'd brought her violin and played for him Spanish folk songs, classical pieces, even attempting one of Julian's compositions from memory. You're different when you play now, Emilio observed, his trembling hand reaching for hers. There's something new in your music, something that wasn't there before. I've been listening to remarkable musicians lately, Olivia admitted. Not just listening, her father said with the insight that illness hadn't dimmed. You're feeling their stories through their music. That's what makes a true musician, not technical perfection, but the ability to channel emotion through sound. On impulse, Olivia played a phrase she'd heard on the recording of Julian and Ethan's final performance, a haunting melody that had lingered in her mind. Her interpretation was imperfect, certainly not as polished as Ethan's cello had been, but she poured into it all the complex emotions of the past weeks. Grief, hope, longing, understanding. When she finished, she was startled to see her father's eyes shining with tears. That, he said, is what your music has been missing. Connection to something greater than yourself. That night, as Olivia drove back to Blackwood Manor to collect some paperwork, rain lashed against her windshield, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The manor's lights were dim, but she noticed a faint glow from the studio windows. She found Julian seated at the piano, sheet music spread before him, not playing, just staring, one hand hovering above the keys as if afraid to make contact. It was his birthday today, Julian said without looking up. Ethan would have been 33. Olivia set her bag down and approached cautiously. Is that why you were asking about the Boston clinic today? Because it's his birthday. Julian's shoulders slumped. Ethan had plans for his future. Medical philanthropy was one of them. After an injury nearly ended his career at 20, he became interested in rehabilitative medicine. He would have approved of the trial. He finally looked up at her, his eyes redrimmed. I haven't truly played since the funeral. I tried tonight. For him, my fingers wouldn't obey. Without thinking, Olivia reached for her violin case. Play with me. Julian stared at her as if she'd suggested something scandalous. I can't. You can, she insisted, removing her violin from its case. Not for an audience. Not for critics. Just for music's sake. For Ethan's memory. She positioned the violin under her chin and began to play the melody from the recording, Ethan's part. As best she could remember it, she closed her eyes, focusing on the emotion rather than technical perfection. For several measures, she played alone. Then, so softly she almost missed it. The piano joined her, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Julian's playing was hesitant, occasionally hitting wrong notes, but undeniably alive. They played together, the melody passing between them like a conversation violin asking, piano answering. When they reached the end of what Olivia remembered, Julian continued, improvising a new passage that seemed to speak directly to her heart. When they finally stopped, the silence hummed with possibility. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" Olivia asked, lowering her violin. Julian's hands remained on the keys, as if afraid to break contact now that he'd finally reconnected. "It was terrible. Technically flawed, rhythmically inconsistent." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And the first time I felt alive in 5 years." Their eyes met across the piano, and something shifted between them, no longer merely employer and assistant, not quite friends, but two musicians who had shared something profound. "Boston," Julian said abruptly. "You leave tomorrow for your father's evaluation. When you return," he hesitated, vulnerability flashing across his features. "When you return, perhaps we could play again." "I'd like that," Olivia said softly as she drove home through the rain. Olivia realized she was humming not Ethan's melody, but the new one Julian had improvised. For the first time since taking the position at Blackwood Manor, she felt not just the weight of necessity but the spark of possibility. Something was awakening in the silent rooms of the manor, and perhaps in its owner as well. Harmonious healing. Boston transformed Olivia's father. 2 weeks into the trial, Emilio's tremors had noticeably decreased. The experimental medication wasn't a cure, but it granted him precious moments of steadier hands and clearer speech. When he held his daughter's fingers without shaking, they both wept. "Dr. Velasquez says I'm responding better than expected," Emilio told her during their daily video call. She mentioned a second phase that could extend the benefits. "You should see her face when I tell her about my career as a guitar teacher. She can't believe how much movement I've regained in my fingers." Olivia's heart swelled with hope, even as loneliness tugged at her. The small apartment near the clinic felt empty despite its comfortable furnishings all arranged by Julian through Mrs. Harrington. "And your boss?" Emilio asked, his eyes twinkling with curiosity. "The one who arranged all this? You speak of him differently now." Olivia felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "He's changing, or perhaps returning to who he was before tragedy struck." "Ah," her father nodded knowingly. "Music has that power to heal what words cannot reach." That evening, Olivia's phone chimed with a text from Juliana, rare occurrence that made her heart skip. "Recording attached. Your thoughts welcome." She downloaded the audio file with trembling fingers. Since their impromptu duet 3 weeks ago, she'd wondered if Julian had continued playing in her absence. The answer filled her ears: a new composition, clearly recorded in the Manor studio. The piano was tentative at first, then grew more confident, exploring a theme that seemed to pose a question, and then, unexpectedly, a space in the musica, deliberate pause where another instrument might enter, where a violin might enter. Olivia listened 3 times, then recorded her response, a violin part that answered the piano's question, twining around Julian's melody with both deference to his composition and assertion of her own voice. His reply came minutes later: "Yes, exactly that." For the remainder of her Boston stay, they exchanged musical fragments, Julian sending piano pieces, Olivia responding with violin. Neither mentioned what they were creating together or put a name to the connection growing between them. It existed in the realm of music, where words weren't necessary. 6 weeks after leaving Blackwood Manor, Olivia returned. The Boston clinic had accepted Emilio into the second phase of the trial, with accommodations provided for the duration. It was the best possible outcome. Yet anxiety knotted her stomach as she drove up the winding road to the manor. Julian stood in the doorway as she approached, tall and still reserved, but with something new in his bearing, a tentative openness. His eyes met hers, and the corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost be called a smile. "Welcome back," he said simply. That evening, after Olivia had settled in, Julian invited her to the studio. The grand piano gleamed under soft lighting, and beside it stood a music stand with sheets of handwritten notation. "I've been composing again," Julian admitted, almost shyly. "Nothing like before. I'm rusty, and the ideas come slower. But they come." Olivia studied the pages, recognizing fragments they'd exchanged during her absence, now woven together into a cohesive piece. "It's beautiful." "Does it have a name?" Julian hesitated. "I've been calling it Reprieve. For your brother. For all of us who get second chances we don't deserve." He gestured to the violin case she'd brought with her. "Would you play it with me? Properly this time, not just exchanged recordings." They played together until midnight, refining passages, adjusting tempos, losing themselves in the conversation of instruments. Julian's technique was returning, still not the flawless precision of his recordings with Ethan, but alive with new emotional depth. As weeks passed, their musical partnership deepened. Julian began teaching composition classes remotely for a prestigious conservatory, his first step back into the musical world. Olivia practiced with renewed purpose, her playing enriched by Julian's mentorship and their collaborative work. One evening, as autumn turned to winter, Julian invited Olivia to dinner in the Manor's formal dining room, a space she'd never seen used before. "I have a proposition," he said as Mrs. Harrington served the first course. "The Boston Symphony has approached me about a benefit concert for medical research, specifically neurological disorders." Olivia's fork paused midway to her mouth. You're going to perform publicly again. We are, Julian corrected gently. If you're willing, Reprieve has evolved into something worthy of an audience, something Ethan would have been proud of. Their eyes met across the candlelit table, and Olivia understood what this meant to him: not just a return to public performance, but a step toward redemption, toward living again. Of course I'll play with you, she said softly, though I'm hardly at the level of musicians you've performed with before. Julian's gaze never wavered. You play with honesty. Technical perfection without emotion is just mathematics. You taught me that. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of how far they'd both come, and how intertwined their journeys had become. The night of the Boston Symphony benefit arrived with snowflakes swirling against velvet darkness. Backstage, Olivia adjusted her midnight blue gown, her fingers unusually steady despite the prestigious venue and sold-out crowd. Julian appeared beside her, impeccable in his tuxedo. Your father is in the front row. The clinic arranged transportation. Tears pricked Olivia's eyes. Thank you. Julian's hand found hers, a brief, warm pressure, ready to make Ethan proud. They walked onto the stage together, greeted by polite applause tinged with curiosity about the reclusive composer's return and his unknown partner. Olivia caught sight of her father, sitting tall in his wheelchair, his smile radiant. Julian spoke briefly to the audience about the research being funded, about second chances and healing. He didn't mention Ethan directly, but when he turned to the piano, his gaze lingered on an empty seat in the front row, reserved in his brother's memory. That the first notes of Reprieve filled the concert, whole piano and violin in intimate conversation, telling a story of loss, longing, and ultimately, hope. Olivia felt rather than saw Julian's approval as her violin sang the passages they'd refined together over months. When they finished, there was a moment of complete silence before the audience rose in thunderous applause. Julian took Olivia's hand as they bowed, and she felt the tremor in his fingers, emotion, not fear. Backstage, Emilio waited for them, his eyes bright with tears. You played from your soul tonight. Mihija, we both did, Olivia said, glancing at Julian, who was accepting congratulations from symphony officials with newfound grace. Later, as they stood in the quiet of the green room, Julian turned to her with an expression she'd never seen before, vulnerability mixed with certainty. I've been offered a visiting composer position at the conservatory, he said, and the symphony wants to commission a full suite based on Reprieve. Julian, that's wonderful, Olivia exclaimed. You're returning to the world. To a world I left in shambles, he said quietly. I'm not sure I can navigate it alone. His eyes held a question he couldn't quite voice. Olivia took a step closer, her heart racing. You don't have to, she whispered. Not anymore. Symphony of Second Chances. Spring came to Blackwood Manor with a riot of color and renewal. The gardens, neglected for years, bloomed under new care. Julian's unexpected interest in cultivating life rather than merely maintaining existence. From her window, Olivia watched him conferring with the gardener, pointing to areas where wildflowers might thrive alongside more traditional plantings. 10 months had transformed them both. Julian's visiting composer position had expanded to a permanent faculty appointment, bringing young musicians to the manor for masterclasses. The eastern attic, once a shrine to grief, now served as a teaching studio where Ethan's cello was occasionally played by promising students. Olivia divided her time between the manor and Boston, where her father continued to respond well to treatments. She'd accepted first violin position with a chamber ensemble affiliated with the conservatory, a role Julian had and encouraged her to pursue despite her initial doubts. You were right, she told him one evening as they walked the manor grounds, the setting sun painting everything in amber light. I did need to play for an audience again, not just for my father or for us. Julian's hand found hers, a gesture that had become natural over the months. Music requires witnesses. Even Ethan knew that, extrovert that he was. They had reached a small memorial garden Julian had planted near the eastern wing, a peaceful space with a simple stone bearing Ethan's name and the dates of his brief, brilliant life. The commission is complete, Julian said, his voice soft with wonder. 5 movements tracing grief to acceptance. I never thought I'd finish something of this magnitude again. Symphony of Second Chances, Olivia mused. It's a perfect title. Julian turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I've asked the symphony to credit us both. It wouldn't exist without you. Julian, no, it's your composition, your vision, our vision, he corrected gently. You didn't just help me play again, Olivia. You helped me live again. The truth of his words hung in the twilight between them. What had begun as employer and assistant had evolved into musical collaborators, then friends, and finally something deeper, love neither had expected but both now embraced. The symphony's world premiere was scheduled for autumn, coinciding with the anniversary of Ethan's death, a date Julian now approached with commemoration rather than dread. Boston Medical Center had named its new neurological research wing after Ethan Blackwood. Funded in part by proceeds from Julian's return to recording and performing, Emilio had moved into a garden cottage on the manor grounds, where he taught guitar to local children, his hands steadied by the trial's successful treatment. Each evening, the sounds of 3 instruments, piano, violin, and guitar, filled the once silent manor with new life. On the night before the symphony's premiere, Julian and Olivia sat in the studio, making final notations on their parts. The piece would feature them as soloists with the full orchestra, their public declaration of artistic partnership. "I received a letter today," Julian said, sliding an envelope across the desk, "from Ethan's former fiancée, Natalie. She's coming to the premiere." Olivia understood the significance. Natalie had cut all ties after the accident, her grief and anger too overwhelming to maintain connection with the man she held responsible for her beloved's death. "Are you ready to see her?" Olivia asked gently. Julian's eyes met hers, clear and steady. "5 years ago, I couldn't have faced her. Now, ... He took a deep breath. "Now I can honor Ethan's memory without drowning in guilt. I can remember joy alongside grief. You taught me that was possible." "We taught each other," Olivia corrected, reaching for his hand. "Your generosity gave my father his dignity back. My music found its purpose again in your compositions." Julian brought her fingers to his lips. "I hired an assistant for money," he murmured against her skin. "But you stayed for something else entirely." "Love," Olivia said simply. "Not just for you, though that came later. Love for the music we create together. Love for the healing we've found in each other's brokenness." The premiere of Symphony of Second Chances filled Boston's Grand Concert Hall. In the front row sat Emilio, proudly erect with only occasional tremors, and beside him, Natalie, who had embraced Olivia with unexpected warmth at the rehearsal. As the conductor raised his baton, Julian and Olivia exchanged a glance that held volumes: acknowledgement of the journey, gratitude for second chances, and promise for the future. The first movement began with Julian alone at the piano, playing a solitary, haunting theme that spoke of isolation and loss. Then Olivia's violin entered, not answering but accompanying, walking alongside rather than leading away. Together, their instruments told a story of 2 people who had found each other through music, when words would never have been enough. By the final movement, when the full orchestra swelled around them in a celebration of renewal, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. As the last notes faded, Julian reached for Olivia's hand, and they faced the audience together, not as the broken souls they had once been, but as artists reborn through the very pain that might have destroyed them. Later that night, in the quiet of Blackwood Manor, they stood in the eastern attic where their journey had begun. The silver key hung on a delicate chain around Olivia's neck, now a symbol of the doors they had unlocked together. "I have something to show you," Julian said, leading her to a cabinet she hadn't opened during her cataloging months ago. Inside lay a small velvet box. This was Ethan's. He was designing it when, before the accident, he opened the box to reveal a ring of stunning platinum band with a single diamond that caught and fractured light like music made visible. "He told me once that when you find the person who makes your life's work meaningful again, you shouldn't hesitate." Julian's voice was steady, but his eyes shimmered with emotion. "I hesitated too long with so many things, Olivia. I don't want to make that mistake with us." As he knelt before her, Olivia felt her heart expand with the certainty that some melodies are written across lifetimes, that some harmonies are inevitable, even when they arise from discord. "Will you compose the rest of this life with me?" Julian asked, holding the ring between them like a promise. Olivia's answer was as clear and true as the note of a perfectly tuned violin, single word that contained within it an entire symphony of possibility. "Yes." In the distance, from the cottage where Emilio slept peacefully, came the faint sound of guitar strings stirring in the night breeze, Nietzsche's gentle accompaniment to a love that had begun with pain but blossomed into healing. Like the finest music, their story hadn't ended with resolution, but with an opening to new movements yet to be written together.